The sun hadn't yet broken through the thick canopy of North Carolina's forgotten woods. The air was damp, heavy, and quiet, too quiet for comfort. But in the distance, padded paws moved with precision. Ranger, a retired German Shepherd K9, maneuvered through the underbrush with the kind of discipline that never left a trained dog. He hadn't always been like this, mud-stained, gaunt, and alone. Not long ago, he wore a vest with a flag stitched to the side and responded to commands barked in urgency. He had saved lives, found bombs, protected his handler like a shadow that breathed. But when his handler was killed during their second deployment, Ranger had spiraled. He was deemed too unstable for adoption. No one wanted a dog who only understood war. So he was dumped, just like that. And now, this forest had become his unwanted kingdom. This morning, something changed. It was the scent, faint but sharp. Human. And not just human, but suffering. Panic.
Pain. Blood.
Ranger stopped mid-step, had high, ears alert. He turned sharply and began to follow it. The trail wasn't easy. It weaved through broken trees and across shallow creeks, but Ranger was built for this. 20 minutes later, he found the source, a clearing. And in the center of it, chained to an old oak tree, was a man. The soldier's head hung low, blood dried across his brow. His uniform was tattered, his boots worn to the sole. Both arms were pulled tight behind him, shackled with thick metal chains that cut into his wrists. Flies circled him like shadows. Ranger froze. Then, he crept forward slowly, sniffing the air. The man didn't stir. But as the dog approached, the soldier's head weakly lifted. One eye opened, cracked and swollen. "A dog," the man rasped. "Am I seeing things?" Ranger didn't respond. He simply sat right in front of him and tilted his head. The soldier let out a breath. "You're real." The man's name patch, barely clinging to his chest, read Sergeant James Miller. He'd been missing for 4 days. The last thing he remembered was heading out on a morning hike during leave. He needed the silence. He needed to be alone with the weight of war that still pressed down on his chest. He never expected to be jumped, ambushed. He never saw the face of whoever chained him here, just a flash of light, then darkness, then pain. Now there was only this dog. And the dog didn't leave. For hours, Ranger stayed beside him. Occasionally, he would pace in a circle, sniff the air, scan the trees, but he didn't bark. He didn't whimper.
He watched.
Protected. Waited. And when night fell and the wind began to bite, Ranger did something Sergeant Miller didn't expect. He pressed his body against the man's leg, offering what little warmth he had. A shiver ran through Miller's frame, but his lips curved upward. Just a little. "You trained, huh?" he murmured. "You must have been one of the good ones." Ranger closed his eyes for a moment, almost like he understood. By morning, something in both of them had shifted. The man, too weak to cry for help anymore, began to whisper stories to the dog, memories from the war, dreams he had before the nightmare started. And the dog listened, eyes sharp,
Tail still.
mind focused. Then, just as the sun began to rise behind the treetops, Ranger stood. He had made a decision. He turned toward the path they had come from, took 3 steps, then stopped and looked back. Miller blinked slowly. "You leaving?" Ranger huffed quietly through his nose, then took off, vanishing into the trees like a ghost. He wasn't abandoning him. He was going to get help. Ranger moved like a bullet through the forest, leaping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches. His heart pounded with urgency. He had no handler, no command to follow, but something deep in his bones told him this was a mission. His mission. The scent of the soldier still clung to his snout, but he pushed it aside. Now he had memorized the path. He would come back. He had to. But first he needed to find someone. Anyone who could help. The dog's mind operated on instinct, but there was something else driving him now. Memory. He remembered trucks. He remembered barracks. He remembered humans in uniforms who gave him food, who spoke words with purpose. Somewhere nearby, there had to be one of those places. Chapter 6: The Outpost. After nearly 2 hours of running, his paws raw and his chest heaving, Ranger reached the edge of the woods. Beyond the last line of trees stood a lonely asphalt road. And on the other side, a weather-worn sign. Whitemont Veterans Outpost, 2 miles. Ranger didn't hesitate. He darted across the road, narrowly avoiding a passing pickup truck that honked and swerved, the driver too stunned to make sense of a German shepherd bolting out of the woods. The outpost wasn't much, just a cluster of small buildings, a flagpole, and a gravel lot where 3 or 4 dusty cars sat. A security guard stood at the front gate, sipping coffee, his posture relaxed, and his mind clearly miles away. His name tag read Morris. Ranger bounded toward the gate, barking sharply. Once, then twice, then again. Morris jolted, spilling some coffee on his vest. "Whoa. Where did you come from, boy?" Ranger barked again, tail stiff, pacing back and forth before running a few feet, then turning to look back at the guard. Morris frowned. "You want me to follow you?" Another bark. Then Ranger sprinted a few feet, looked back again, and barked louder. Now Morris was fully awake. He set down his cup and grabbed his radio. "This is Post 3. I've got a German shepherd here, no collar, but he's trying to get me to follow him. Something's off." A crackle of static replied. "Copy that. Stay put. Animal control's on the way." "No, you don't get it," Morris muttered, eyes narrowing. "He's not just lost. He's trained. This is a military dog." Ranger barked once more, and then, for the last time, took off into the woods. Morris cursed under his breath, grabbed his flashlight and a utility knife, and followed. It wasn't easy keeping up, but the dog always made sure to stay just within sight, slowing now and then to make sure the human was still behind him. Ranger didn't know if this man could help. He only knew he had to try. Nearly 40 minutes later, they reached the clearing. The moment Morris saw the figure chained to the tree, he stopped cold. Jesus. Sergeant Miller was barely conscious now. His lips were cracked, his skin pale. The chains had cut deeper into his wrists overnight, and fresh blood trickled down his forearms.
"Hey!"
Morris shouted, running forward. "Hey, soldier, can you hear me?" Miller's head moved slightly. "You're going to be okay, man. I got you. I got you." Morris knelt down and examined the chains, heavy duty, padlocked tight. But no time to waste. He took the knife from his belt and began sawing at the thinner points where the rust had weakened the links. As he worked, his eyes flicked to Ranger. "You did this," he whispered. "You found him." Ranger didn't move. He simply watched, standing guard, like he'd been trained to do. Like he was back on duty. It took 10 minutes to get Miller free. When the last link snapped, the man collapsed into Morris's arms. "I'm not going to let you go, brother. You're safe now," Morris said, hoisting him over his shoulder with effort. "Let's get you out of here." Ranger led the way. They emerged from the forest just as paramedics arrived at the gate, sirens cutting through the silence. Miller was rushed into the ambulance, and Morris turned back toward the woods to see the German shepherd watching from the trees. "Come on, boy," he said softly. But Ranger didn't move. He'd done his job. Now the question was, would anyone take him back? Or was he destined to disappear again into the shadows, a hero no one knew by name? 2 days had passed since the dramatic rescue. Sergeant James Miller lay in a hospital bed at the VA Medical Center in Raleigh, recovering slowly but surely. For fluids dripped beside him, feeding his body what the last 5 days in the woods had drained. Nurses came and went. Police officers asked questions he couldn't fully answer. How had he ended up chained to a tree? Why wasn't there any sign of struggle? Who would do this to a soldier? But Miller's focus was elsewhere. "Where's the dog?" he asked, voice raspier than usual. No one had an answer. Across town, back at the White Veterans Outpost, Ranger sat in a holding pen built for stray dogs. It wasn't a cage, but it wasn't freedom either. They'd given him food, clean water, even a bath to rinse the forest from his fur. A volunteer had called animal control to scan for a chip, but there wasn't one. No tags. No records. Nothing. He must have been military, Morris told the vet tech on duty. You don't see a dog sit like that, wait like that, unless he was trained. He's disciplined. No doubt. The tech nodded. watching Ranger through the bars. But there's no proof. And no handler has come forward. Morris felt his chest tighten. That soldier. He would have died out there. Ranger sat with his back straight, eyes unblinking. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply waited, like he always had. Like someone was coming. And someone was. That afternoon, Miller's attending nurse entered with a clipboard in one hand and a determined look on her face. "You got approved for early supervised discharge," she said. "Said you're insisting on seeing someone?" "Yeah," Miller said, swinging his legs over the bed. "I need to see a dog." Back at the outpost. Ranger lay still in the pen as footsteps approached. He didn't lift his head until a familiar scent hit the air, sweat, blood, and pain, but also something else now. Healing. The door opened slowly. Sergeant Miller stood in the entrance, leaning on a cane, looking more like himself again, if not older, wearier. He said nothing at first, just stared. And then, softly, "You stayed with me." Ranger stood slowly, then took 2 steps forward. "Everyone keeps asking me who did this to me," Miller whispered. "Truth is, I don't know. But I know who saved me." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. "Come here, boy." That was all it took. Ranger trotted forward and pressed his head gently against Miller's knee. The man placed a hand on the dog's head, fingers trembling, and for the first time since being found, tears filled his eyes. "You saved my life. And no one even asked your name." Behind them, Morris stood watching, arms crossed. "They're saying he can't stay here," he said quietly. "Since there's no paperwork, no official record of him being a military K-9, he's technically just a stray." Miller looked up, his hand still on Ranger's neck. "Then I'll give him a name," he said. "I'll register him myself. He's not a stray. He's a soldier." Morris raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to call him?" The soldier glanced down, his mouth twitching into the smallest smile. "Valor." A few days later, the paperwork was finalized. Sergeant Miller became Ranger's, now Valor's, legal owner. The story began circulating on local news. German Shepherd finds and rescues soldier in the forest. People were calling it a miracle, a heroic tale of a dog with no mission who found one. But to Miller, it wasn't about headlines. He didn't know who had left him to die.
He didn't know why.
But he knew this. In the darkest moment of his life, when no one else came, a dog did. And not just any dog. A forgotten soldier. And now they had each other.
But peace was short-lived.
That night, as Miller and Valor sat quietly on the porch of the small house provided by the Veterans Program, a car rolled slowly past the street. Its windows were tinted. It didn't stop, but it circled the block again 5 minutes later. Valor stood up, ears sharp, growl low. Miller narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't over yet. The chains may have come off, but the danger hadn't passed. The old porch creaked beneath Sergeant Miller's boots as he stood beside Valor. The German Shepherd, now alert and growling low in his throat, didn't take his eyes off the street. The car had circled the block again, its tinted windows revealing nothing, just a silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. Watching. Miller's grip on his cane tightened. The wounds on his wrists hadn't fully healed, but he didn't need full strength to feel it in his gut. This wasn't random. Valor stepped closer to the edge of the porch, eyes locked on the street, tail stiff. There was no barking, just a stillness that came from training and instinct. This wasn't a dog growling at a squirrel or a passerby. This was a warning. "They know," Miller whispered under his breath. "They know I survived." For a moment, the weight of that sentence pressed down on him harder than the chains ever had. He still didn't remember everything, just flashes. The gloved hands, the blow to the back of his head, the cold bite of metal around his wrists. And now, a car watching from the shadows. The vehicle finally rolled away, but the silence it left behind was louder than any engine. Inside, Miller pulled out the worn leather satchel that had been returned to him with his belongings. Inside were a few essentials: a pocket knife, a lighter, a small field notebook, and something he hadn't noticed before: a USB drive, tucked into the lining. He blinked, confused. He hadn't put it there. Plugging it into his laptop, he opened the single file it contained. Surveillance footage. It was grainy, time-stamped 2 days before his disappearance. The footage showed him entering the national park for his hike, alone. But 5 minutes later, a second figure appeared, dressed in black, face obscured. The footage cut off shortly after. They had followed Miller into the trees. His heart pounded in his chest. Why would someone plant this in his bag? And, more importantly, who wanted him silenced? Valor rested beside the chair, eyes flicking between his handler, at the front door. He hadn't relaxed since the car passed. His body stayed tense, nostrils flaring as if searching the air for clues. "Looks like we've got unfinished business," Miller muttered. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months.
Hey.
"It's Miller. I need a favor. No questions. Just meet me tomorrow, Outpost Gate. 0800. The next morning, the sun rose over the veteran outpost, casting long shadows across the gravel road. A black SUV pulled up to the gate, and from it stepped Elena Voss, former Army intelligence and Miller's closest ally from the service. She was tall, composed, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "You look like hell," she said, eyeing the bandages on his wrists. "You should see the other guy," Miller deadpanned. Elena's eyes flicked to Valor. "That the one from the news? He's the reason I'm still breathing." Valor stared at her in silence. Then, without hesitation, sat beside Miller's boot.
Loyal.
Miller handed her the USB. "Where'd you get this?" she asked, slipping it into a reader connected to her tablet. "I found it in my satchel. Someone wanted me to see it." The video played again. Elena watched closely. "This timestamp," she narrowed her eyes. "You went off-grid at this exact moment." "I think someone on the inside tried to erase me," Miller said quietly. "But I don't know why." Elena looked up at him, her expression now harder. "We're going to find out. But you need to be careful. If that car from last night wasn't a coincidence, they might try again." Miller nodded. "I'm not running. Not this time." Back at home, Miller reinforced the doors. He installed a security system and moved a cot to the living room, where Valor now slept. Not in a kennel. Not on a rug. Beside the window. Always watching. And then it happened again. 3 nights later, a rustle at the back door. A flicker of movement caught by the sensor light. And a low growl from Valor that woke Miller instantly. He grabbed the bat from beneath the couch and crept to the kitchen. The sliding door had been unlocked. It was locked before. Valor bolted through the kitchen and out the door before Miller could stop him. "Valor." The dog disappeared into the night, barking once, sharp and urgent. Miller stepped outside, adrenaline spiking, heart racing. In the darkness, he heard it. A scream. Then silence. Moments later, Valor returned, blood on his snout, but no visible wounds. He walked calmly to Miller and sat down at the edge of the yard. A man in black lay unconscious, face exposed. And Miller recognized him. It was someone from his own unit. The truth was about to unravel. The man on the ground groaned, face scratched and bleeding from where Valor had brought him down. His body lay half on the lawn, half in the garden bed, right under the window he'd been trying to pry open. He wore black tactical gear, no insignias, no rank, no ID. But Miller didn't need a badge to know exactly who he was. "Collins," Miller muttered, his voice hard and low. The man's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his name, panic rising in them when he saw Miller standing over him. But what caught his attention faster was Valor, positioned at his handler's side, rigid and silent, his teeth still stained red. "I didn't mean," Collins tried. "You didn't mean to get caught," Miller cut in. "But here you are." Collins coughed, trying to sit up, but Miller raised the bat in warning. "Don't move." He turned his head slightly. "Valor, stay." The dog didn't blink. He stood like a statue, eyes fixed on Collins, a living wall. Miller pulled out his phone and dialed Elena again. "It's me. You need to get over here. Bring zip ties." 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness. Elena stepped out of her SUV, gun already drawn. She approached fast, took one look at Collins, and narrowed her eyes. I always had a bad feeling about him, she muttered. Wasn't he part of logistics? Yeah, Miller said, still staring down at the man who had once shared beers with him on base. But he wasn't delivering supplies, was he? Elena knelt down and zip-tied Collins's hands behind his back. Start talking. Collins groaned, then spat blood onto the grass. You don't get it. It wasn't personal. That's funny, Miller said, stepping closer. Because being chained to a tree and left to die feels pretty damn personal. Collins looked between them, face twitching. You weren't supposed to survive. And yet here I am, Miller replied. Because of him. He nodded toward Valor, who finally sat, but remained locked in a watchful stance. You're not just some traitor, Elena said. You're part of something bigger. So what is it? Who gave the order? Collins hesitated. It's bigger than you think. Some of us, we were told you were a risk. That after your discharge, you had files, records about operations that weren't meant to exist. Operations like the one in Dutchenby? Miller asked coldly. Collins flinched. That mission was buried, Miller continued. We were told to forget it, to never speak of it again. But I kept a backup. Because I knew something was wrong. Elena turned to him, eyes wide. You never told me. I couldn't, Miller said. I didn't even remember where I hid it until the footage showed up in my bag. He looked down at Collins. So this is about cleaning house, huh? Tie up the loose ends. Command is scared, Collins whispered. If it comes out, if the wrong people get that file. Wrong people? Miller barked. You mean the public? The families who never got answers. Collins shut his eyes. You don't understand what you're playing with. Miller stepped back, shaking his head. I understand exactly what I'm playing with. And I'm not alone. He reached down and scratched behind Valor's ears. This dog saved me. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He just acted because that's what loyalty looks like. That's what courage looks like. You followed orders like a coward. Elena stood. We're turning him in. I know people at the DOJ. If he talks, maybe we can expose everything. Miller nodded. It's time. Collins was loaded into Elena's SUV and driven into the night. But Miller didn't feel peace.
Not yet.
He stood under the stars, arms folded, Valor at his side. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive, full of what they'd survived and what still waited ahead. Miller knew this wasn't the end of it. Collins was just one part of the chain, and someone had sent him. But they'd made a mistake. They'd underestimated a man who refused to be forgotten, and a dog who refused to walk away. As they headed inside, Miller glanced down at Valor. You ready for whatever comes next? Valor didn't wag his tail. He simply walked beside him, step for step. And in that quiet, steady rhythm, Miller found something he hadn't felt in years. Strength. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting narrow beams of light across the hardwood floor where Valor lay resting. His eyes remained open, ears twitching at every creak of the house. He had slept, but never deeply. Not since that night in the kitchen. Miller poured a black coffee into a dented mug and stared out the window. The grass still bore the scuffle marks where Collins had tried to break in. The blood had been cleaned, the soil smoothed, but the memory lived in every glance, every sound, every breath. It wasn't over.
But now, for the first time, Miller had something.
A plan. He sat down at the kitchen table, where a laptop sat open. On the screen, the surveillance footage looped again and again, Collins following him into the woods. The timestamp burned into Miller's mind. Elena had taken Collins to a private DOJ contact, someone who worked quietly under the radar, someone who specialized in internal corruption investigations. She had promised results, promised protection. But Miller knew better. You can't trust a system to clean itself, he muttered. Valor lifted his head from the floor, watching him silently. Then, without being called, the dog stood and walked over, sitting beside the table. Miller reached down and scratched his neck gently. They're going to come harder next time, buddy. You ready? Valor gave a single, quiet huff, as if to say, always. Later that day, Elena returned. Her eyes were tired, but her jaw was set. "I got a name," she said. "The one who gave the green light to take you out." Miller tensed. "Tell me." "Colonel Richard Levitt." Miller felt like someone had punched the air from his lungs. Levitt. He wasn't just anyone. He was their old commanding officer. The man who had delivered their deployment orders. The man who had stood at the funeral of Miller's fallen comrades and saluted without a flicker of guilt. "He gave Collins the order?" Miller asked, disbelief thick in his voice. Elena nodded. "We have a partial confession. Collins cracked after being promised immunity. Levitt ran Black Ops off the books, used you and others as pawns. That Dutchenby mission? You never got debriefed on it. It was never sanctioned." Miller sank into a chair, head in his hands. "Why me?" he asked. "Why not just bury the files?" "Because you remembered," Elena said gently. "And they knew that meant trouble." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the sound of Valor's breathing. Miller looked up. "We go public." Elena hesitated. "That's dangerous. You'll lose every protection the DOJ offered. I already almost died in the woods, chained to a tree like a dog. They didn't silence me then, and they won't now." He turned to Valor, who watched him with calm, unwavering eyes. "You saved me. Now we save others." That night, they recorded the video. Elena set up the camera while Miller sat in front of a plain wall, Valor at his feet. No polish. No script. Just truth. He stared into the lens. "My name is Sergeant James Miller. I served this country for 8 years. I believed in the system. I followed orders. I lost men under my command. But what I didn't know is that some of those orders were never official. Some were illegal. And when I found out they tried to erase me, they left me to die in the woods." He paused and reached down, resting his hand on Valor's head. "This dog, Valor, found me. He saved my life. He had no handler, no command, just instinct and loyalty. More loyalty than the people who wore my same uniform." Miller leaned forward, voice steady. "I have documents. I have names. And I'm not afraid anymore. If anything happens to me after this video, the evidence goes straight to every news outlet in the country." He looked down at Valor. "We survived once. We'll do it again." They posted the video at midnight. By morning, it had over 2 million views. The news exploded. Reporters camped outside Miller's house. Other veterans came forward with stories. And just as Miller expected, threats returned. Calls from block numbers. Cars parked too long near his house. But he was no longer alone. The country knew. And Valor never left his side. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Miller sat on the porch again, staring out at the quiet street. Valor sat beside him, unmoving, eyes alert. "They're going to try something," Miller said aloud. And just as he said it, a black van turned the corner and parked. Doors opened. Men stepped out. But this time, they weren't ready for what came next. The black van's doors slammed open. 3 men stepped out fast, dressed in plain black, moving like they'd done this before. But this time wasn't like before. This time, Valor was waiting. The moment the first man crossed the front gate, Valor bolted from the porch with a snarl that ripped through the silence. He lunged, knocking the man flat before the others could react. Miller was already up, shotgun in hand. Not to shoot, just to warn. "Back off," he shouted, stepping forward, heart pounding but steady. "This ends now." The second man froze. The third reached for something inside his jacket, but Elena's voice rang out behind them. "Don't even try it." She stood at the end of the street with a group of off-duty vets, each one armed, each one watching. They'd come because they'd seen the video. Because someone finally stood up and said what they were all too scared to say. The men from the van hesitated, then turned and ran. Not a word. Just silence, swallowed by tires screeching. Valor stood tall at the gate, chest heaving, eyes locked on the disappearing threat. Then he turned back to Miller and sat. It was over. Or, at least, this chapter was. Chapter 19. A New Life. Weeks later, Colonel Levitt was arrested. The files Miller released sparked a full-scale investigation. Whistleblowers stepped out of the shadows. A new law passed, protecting military canines and veterans who speak out.
Miller didn't ask for thanks.
He never wanted fame, but he did get something more valuable.
Peace.
He and Valor moved to a quiet cabin by the lake. No cameras, no threats. Just freedom. Sometimes, in the quiet of the morning, Miller would watch Valor staring across the water, still and proud. A hero with no medal. No parade. Just a heart too big to give up on someone the world had left behind. And Miller knew he'd never be alone again. Because when the world forgets you, a true dog never will.